second. Well, so very nice to see you again. So I think that we have for about 3-4 participants. That's fine. Let's see. Let's share the screen. And here, share. Okay. So today we are going to discuss about dementia. But as usual, I'd like to start with a review of what we did last time. So last time we actually did attention deficit disorder, and for those who were not present, they might find this somewhat interesting. We talked about the extent of the problem, ADHD I'm referring to. I did not start speaking about the dementia yet. The prevalence was pretty prominent, 8.9% compared with depressive disorder, 5.3%, bipolar disorder, 1.1%, bipolar 2 disorder, 0.6, schizophrenia, 1.3, substance use disorder, 14.5. So 8.9 is a relatively frequent issue. By the way, the prevalence of mental illness in general in the United States was 27.7 in 2003. According to the National Comorbidity Survey, a replication study, that means the one done on 2003, not in 1992. We discussed the definition of the ADHD according to the DSM-5, and I was noting at that time that it's a much more complicated diagnosis than substance use disorder. ADD needs 6 out of 9 criteria to be present. Quite a bit of sine qua non conditions. Substance use disorder actually needs only 2 out of 11 criteria to be present. We mentioned that the pathophysiology is also rather different than everything else. The genetic component is much stronger in ADD. The heritability index, which is the genetic variance divided by the phenotypic variance, is 0.6 to 0.98. A index of 1 means that all the phenotypic variance is caused by genetic factors, and a index of 0 means that there is no genetic component. Everything is due to the environment. So we also talked about the treatment. We just focused on the biggest group of medications that we use for the treatment of ADD, which is the stimulants. And finally, we talked about the fact that 50% of the kids and adolescents who meet the criteria for ADD, they will continue to be adults who suffer of ADD as well. Okay, so we went too far. Let me also do something else. Let me move this thing out of the way. Okay, so we are talking today about dementia. We are going to talk about the history of this diagnosis, how it became to be called dementia, or to be more modern, a major neurocognitive impairment. And we'll talk about how widespread this phenomena is nowadays. We will look at the definition according to the DSM-5. We will also look at the varieties of dementias, because dementia is just the end path of a lot of things that can go wrong and result in this brain dysfunction we call dementia. Because there are 35 variety of dementias, we're not going to have time to look into anything but one, Alzheimer type dementia. We are going to talk about the comorbidity, and the comorbidity doesn't mean the presence of 2 independent psychiatric illnesses like usual. It means actually the problems that can appear in the course, in the progression of Alzheimer. And of course, we are going to speak about the treatment in general lines. Well, so let's see, there is a little bit of malfunction here. Okay, so Let's try again. Okay, so this is the history of this concept of dementia. Dementia comes from the word dementatus, which in Latin means out of one's mind. If you think about this, it's a concept that can apply to any psychiatric illness, not just dementia. Many scientists played a role in defining this concept the way it is known nowadays. The more notables are Celsus, not to be mistaken for Paracelsus. Paracelsus was a toxicologist who lived in Switzerland in the 1400s. Celsus lived in first century AD. And he was the one who first identified a illness that comes with age and consists of cognitive deterioration. The next person was important. The definition of dementias was Oribasius. Oribasius was the private doctor of Julian, Emperor Julian. Emperor Julian was the last non-Christian emperor of the Roman Empire. Actually, by that time was the Byzantine Empire. The next important figure was Jean-Étienne Esquirol, another famous psychiatrist. Actually, he's the first psychiatrist who had a role in defining this illness. Esquirol is the one who refined the diagnosis even further and established the presence of delusions and hallucinations in the course of this illness. Then Kraepelin was actually the person who distinguished the senile from the dementias from the dementia precox. Dementia precox turns out to be not a dementia, but actually schizophrenia. But he was the one who distinguished, who contributed to the definition of the dementias in general. And finally, we got to the most important figure, Alzheimer, Aloysius Alzheimer, which was a psychiatrist in the turn of the century, 1900s, who actually was the one who defined not just the symptomatology, but also the etiology of the illness, the histopathological changes that underlie the symptoms of dementia. So now let's see how bad is this issue. It's pretty bad. At the beginning, in the age group of 65 to 70, the prevalence is not that impressive, 1.9%. But from that point on, it starts doubling each 5 years. It ends up at a prevalence of 6.3 in the age group 75 to 80. And at the prevalence of 21%, 22% in the age group 85 to 90. The reality is even worse because these are numbers for the general population. In primary care settings, the numbers are higher, and in nursing homes, the prevalence gets to be close to 60%. So there's another little bit of a worse or a grim outlook when it comes to prevalence. The population is aging in all the developed countries, including the United States. So it is anticipated that these numbers are going to grow. So you are very likely going to run into dementia quite often once you go in private practice, depending, of course, of the settings as well, the settings in which you will practice. So let's see the diagnosis of dementia the way DSM-5 defines it. Do not forget that DSM-5 is a convention. It's a collection of conventions when it comes to diagnosis. But when I am saying that these are conventions, the diagnosis in psychiatry is a convention, I'm not diminishing the scientific basis of this process, because this is not just a bunch of psychiatrists getting together and engaging in some brainstorming and coming up with definitions. They are actually basing all their statements on massive research, which describes the phenomena of mental illness. So do not forget psychiatry is a science in the context of the medical sciences, and as any science out there, it has three purposes: explain, predict, and influence. And the diagnosis is just a tool that we use in pursuing this goal of explaining the illness, predicting its evolution, and finally influencing its course. So, as I said before, the dementia is extremely complex. It is the end path of many things that can go wrong with the human brain. So this is how massive the differential diagnosis is. By the way, some physicians prefer to think about dementia as brain failure, exactly the same in which you talk about hepatic failure or renal failure. You can talk about the brain failure, a very interesting concept. This is a massive mechanism. The brain is a massive mechanism composed of 80 billion components. And when this massive mechanism starts deteriorating, that is going to come with a lot of dysfunction. Now, we are all familiar with a tiny group of dementias in psychiatry, and these are the neurodegenerative dementias. And out of those neurodegenerative dementias, we are more familiar with Alzheimer's disease and maybe dementia with Lewy body. But the rest are pretty much not something that you run into day-to-day practice, and is not something that you will have to address in very routinely. So as you see, there are a lot of causes of dementia. The neurodegenerative causes are the bread and butter of what we do in psychiatry, but there is also a vascular dementia, which has several varieties as well. For example, Binswanger disease is this problem that concerns the small vessels of the white matter of the brain. It's an atherosclerosis of the small vessels of the brain, which chokes the blood supply and causes microinfarcts. By the way, arteriosclerosis is not the same as atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is just a type of arteriosclerosis. It's a thickening and hardening of the blood vessels due to accumulation of plates of cholesterol and other lipids. There is also another vascular dementia that has nothing to do with small vessel disease, but it's just kind of one big stroke in a very unfortunate region that could also lead to manifestations of dementia, despite the fact that the rest of the brain tissue may be intact. And there is finally the hemodynamic insufficiency, which has nothing to do with the circulation of the brain, but is some choking of the blood supply that happens outside the brain, most often because of a carotid stenosis, for example. Then there are other causes of dementia, as you see, neurological causes in MS and NPH, normal pressure hydrocephalus. Brain tumors can also lead to manifestations that are similar to dementia. Just one second, I'll put it back. Then we have endocrine causes. The most notorious and something that you always have to rule out is hypothyroidism, but also hyperparathyroidism can also cause symptoms of dementia. Obviously, hyperparathyroidism goes with a high concentration of calcium, and this usually has a toxic effect on the neurons. And also insulinoma with low blood sugar, that goes with low blood sugar, can do the same thing. The nutritional causes, very easy to rule out, the deficiency of vitamin B1 or thiamine, vitamin B3 or niacin, and of course, the biggest one is vitamin B12 or cyanocobalamin, very easy to exclude as causes of the dementia. Then we have the traumatic causes, dementia, the famous dementia pugilistica, which was observed first in boxers. but nowadays it's actually called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and it was kind of became quite known with the scandal in NFL league. So then there are the metabolic causes, pretty much dysfunctions of the kidney or of the liver can lead to symptomatology that is identical, that practically is identical with dementias. Infectious disease, again, it's part of the part of the routine workup that you do to rule out, and this is the neurosyphilis, very rarely encountered nowadays, and very easy to exclude by VDRL or RPR. And finally, the HIV, also pretty easy to exclude, but it's a little bit of a it's a more roundabout testing. I don't know how it is now, but in my time, you actually have to get an informed consent from the patient to test the patient for HIV. And try to do that with a person who is already cognitively impaired is not going to be a simple situation. Then, of course, the toxic causes, heavy metals like lead, alcohol, chronic alcohol ingestion. We used to call that, I mean, it's still is kind of a different kind of dementia, some different characteristics. Is going to be not that easy to distinguish from the regular senile dementia. Then irradiation and exposure to carbon monoxide. So these the neurodegenerative, I put there a bunch of acronyms. But AD means Alzheimer's dementia, DLB dementia with Lewy body, PDD means Parkinson disease dementia, FTD frontotemporal dementia, HD Huntington dementia, CBS corticobasal syndrome, PSP, progressive supranuclear palsy. But prion disease, although it's a pretty rare disease, it's a very colorful story with this prion disease. First time it was discovered in the tribes of cannibals in Papua New Guinea. The person who discovered this illness was actually a Midwestern doctor by the name Carlton Gajdusek. Gajdusek is probably a Czech or Slovak name, but the man was actually from Midwest. You can't believe how difficult it was to track down this illness. These tribes, first of all, it was a shame to have a person over 20, 25 years old getting demented. Usually Kuru manifests itself through disturbances of sleep. That means people just start sleeping a lot. They have problems with walking and they practically wither away. They would be put in a hut and kind of left to die, actually, and the family would consider this a big shame. So it was very difficult task to track down through the jungle, identify these people who were not very easy to locate, and then trying to convince the families and the patient to give blood tests, and even more of a complication to get the brain of the deceased person in a primitive culture. That was a kind of a unbelievable feat that this Dr. Gajdusek ended up doing. And then what a monumental task to identify the problem, which is not the run-of-the-mill virus or bacteria or fungus. It was actually a type of protein that behaves almost like a pathogen, like a traditional pathogen. That means it can infect people. You get this defective protein or a malformed protein through the intestine if you eat a product that contains this protein, or even it can be passed on through surgical instruments. So it's a very tricky disease, and because it's a protein, it's so much more difficult to identify. And it was the first time in history that we got this information that not just bacteria and germs and fungus and viruses can can cause disease, but actually a protein can cause a disease, behaving like a contagious agent. So what actually happens? Uh, uh, this protein is folded in a faulty way, and it has the capacity when it gets into contact with other similar proteins to change their normal folding pattern into their pathological folding pattern. So it's like it transmits this defect to other similar proteins. It's in a way, it's a completely new mechanism of transmitting the disease. And anyway, these proteins that they cause to change configuration will actually cause a lot of downstream effects that will end up in a neuronal death, premature neuronal death, which will give on the histopathological specimens and also on the MRI, the spongiform aspect, which is typical for prion disease. And by the way, this Dr. Gajdusek got the Nobel Prize for his find, and I think it's definitely a very well-deserved prize for the effort that he made. Unfortunately, a while after, it was discovered that his entourage of teenage Papuans that he brought with him from Papua New Guinea were actually his harem, and he was actually molesting these teenagers. So definitely his fame lost a lot of luster when they discovered that he was actually a child molester. And they didn't really count that these kids that he was molesting or teenagers that he was molesting were for Papua New Guinea. In the face of the law, it's not going to matter who are these people. So he was actually convicted and jailed for child abuse. So let's see now the psychiatric versus medical nature of illness in general. How did we get from this? By the way, this is a restraint chair that was used in West Riding Lunatic Asylum in UK. It's a photography taken in 1869. How do you get from this to this? And obviously, this is a TMS machine. It started with the advent of medicine as a science. We cannot establish for sure at what point medicine stopped being a highly speculative practice based on hunches and the defective use of the reality and started being a science. It is safe to say that in the Middle Eve, medicine was pretty much fantasy. But little by little, especially at the end of 1800 and 1900, the rate of scientific fact to speculation started reversing, and science took over this discipline. And nowadays, medicine in general functions according to the Royal Society's motto, Royal Society's National Science Society of England, of UK, and its motto is nullius in verba. Nullius in verba means take nobody's word. That means we should not accept any statement just because it comes from any kind of authority. We are going to accept only what is based on reproducible scientific experiment or study. Now, the only problem is that psychiatry, having such a complicated object of interest, the brain, kind of fell behind, and medicine advanced, became much more scientific, and the psychiatry kind of was left in the dust, and therefore psychiatry was subjected to all sorts of claims when it tried to state its belonging to the medicine field. For many years, psychiatry and medicine were actually segregated. The psychiatric hospitals were not part of the medical hospital. They were asylums, completely separate from any medical institution. Actually, in Romania, the place where I'm coming from, in a 2 million city, 2 million inhabitant city, Bucharest, there was only one psychiatric hospital. It was a huge hospital. It was the hospital number 9, it was called. That's where all the psychiatric patients were brought. Not a single psychiatric unit in any other hospital in Bucharest. So, there is another huge psychiatric asylum, but near Bucharest. It was called the Bălăceanca hospital. So that was another kind of the butt of all jokes about these psychiatric hospitals. So psychiatric units actually appeared in general hospitals only until a couple of decades ago in the 20th century. And even now, if you look what we are doing right now, we are in a behavioral institute. And the behavioral institute is kind of separate from the other parts of the hospital, Westchester Medical Center. OBGYN or urology, they don't have a separate building in the hospital. They're part of the medical, of the medical units. So you see, this distinction is still kind of affecting the way people think nowadays. Inside psychiatry, this idea was actually accepted. DSM-1, which was published in 1952, talked about pure psychiatric illness and organic disorders, as if the psychiatric illness is non-organic, is somehow esoterical, somehow spiritual, different than the rest of the medicine. DSM-3 and DSM-3R, DSM-2 continued to maintain this dichotomy, organic and non-organic. DSM-3 and 3R introduced the idea of psychiatric illness due to medical and substance use, and eliminated this idea of organic psychiatric illness. DSM-4 continued to maintain the idea of medical and substance use, and the others, they just didn't name the pure, genuine psychiatric illness was actually not called anything but psychiatric disorders. DSM-5 is the only one, the first one who brought the concept of psychiatric illness into medicine, in the sense that you call it, for example, dementia, senile dementia, but then you call it dementia due to other medical conditions. So dementia, senile dementia is a medical condition, and if you look at let's say hypothyroidism is also a medical condition, so it's going to be dementia due to another medical condition. So let's see now the illness itself. What's the story of this illness? Now, Aloysius Alzheimer is the person who did define this illness symptomatologically and histopathologically. So it was a chance encounter. This lady, Auguste Detter, was brought by her husband to the Institution for Mentally Ill and Epileptics in Frankfurt on November 25th, 1901. Aloysius took interest in this, Aloysius Alzheimer took interest in this woman and followed her until she died. And after she died, actually obtained the brain and studied it together with Nissl, Dr. Nissl, of Nissl body fame. Nissl body are the rough endoplastic reticulum in neuron. So he studied with the help of Dr. Nissl and defined the histopathological changes in this illness. Actually, he didn't name this illness after him. It was Kraepelin, which was a colleague of his, who made a distinction between senile dementia and dementia praecox, and senile dementia in the honor of his colleague, Alzheimer, and giving him credit, actually called it Alzheimer's disease, and that's the way it remained for many years until even nowadays. Actually, I would say that Alzheimer is the most famous name in psychiatry. And why am I saying this? Because people don't know the name of Kraepelin. Kraepelin was really the one who dominated psychiatry in Europe, at least before Freud. Freud became the next big thing in psychiatry, but Kraepelin views actually did win in the end because it turns out that psychiatric illness, it is what it is according to what he was supporting. It is a biological illness. So Freud's speculation are kind of nice, nice for from literary standpoint, but they don't hold water. Nowadays, the etiology of psychiatric illness is already very well established. It is in the pathology of the neuron. So now, what causes the problem in Alzheimer's disease? Well, it is about two molecules, beta amyloid and tau proteins. So what is happening, this beta amyloid accumulates and forms plaques. Tau protein is also accumulating, causing neurofibrillary tangles. Now, beta amyloid is just a metabolic product of the metabolism of APP. APP, or amyloid precursor protein, is the precursor of beta amyloid. And APP is actually a normally occurring transmembrane lipoprotein. It's ubiquitous. All the neurons have in their membrane this APP. And APP has a metabolism starting with its synthesis and with its catabolism, which turns the APP into its components, into its elementary components to be used for synthesis of the same, another molecule of APP or other products. Now, the cleavage of the APP, amyloid precursor protein, is done by three enzymes: alpha, beta, and gamma secretase. Alpha secretase actually splits the molecule of APP in soluble components, and there is no problem after that. Beta and gamma secretases split the molecule of APP in a way that leads to beta amyloid. And that's where apolipoprotein E comes into play. Apolipoprotein E it's a protein that facilitates the ingestion of these molecules of beta amyloid into the lysosomes, where it is destroyed. Well, that's where the problem starts, with the apolipoprotein E. Apolipoprotein E actually is determined, is genetically influenced, genetically encoded by a gene called apolipoprotein E epsilon 1 through 4. Epsilon 1 to 3 are okay. These genes will encode good functional apoproteins that will do their job and cause the beta amyloid to be ingested by the lysosome and destroyed. The apolipoprotein E, which is encoded by the gene apolipoprotein E epsilon 4, that's where the problem starts. So if you have beta allele, then you are going to be in trouble. The amyloid, this protein is not going to do its job, and the beta amyloid will accumulate. And what happens is not the plaques themselves are killing the neurons, it's actually the beta amyloid itself. It interferes with a lot of processes in the cell, with a lot of metabolic pathways, causing a massive influx of calcium, electrolyte disturbances, the production of free radicals, which in the end destroy the neuron. So the apolipoprotein E epsilon 4 gene or allele is a marker for Alzheimer. If you are a homozygote for apo epsilon 4, that means you have two of these apo epsilon 4 allele in your genetic code, you have a 50% chance of developing Alzheimer. But that's not all the story, actually. This apo E epsilon 4 is very widespread in the African population, and they don't, in the African population, does not seem to have the same predictive value. So there are some other mechanisms there that intervene. Now we have the tau protein. Tau protein is a component of the microtubules that constitute the skeleton of the neuron, and also a sort of a vascular system that moves the molecules from one place to another. These microtubules are made of tau protein, and that is also accumulating in Alzheimer. This is the way they look under the microscope, the beta amyloid plaques on your left and the neurofibrillary tangles on your right. This is how they look on the PET scan. So nowadays we have 3 amyloid tracers approved by the FDA: florbeta-ben, florbeta-pir, and flutemetamol. So there are 3 kind of complicated names, but just remember that there are some molecules which have in them fluorine 18, the isotope fluorine 18, which latches onto the beta amyloid plaques, and they become visible in the PET scan. This is how the PET scans look like when this radio tracer is used. On the left side is a person without Alzheimer. In the middle is a person with mild cognitive impairment, and in the left is the Alzheimer's disease. So you see how much more of this radio tracer is absorbed by the tissue. So let's see, how do you make the diagnosis? Well, you have to establish if at least one of these areas is impaired: complex attention, executive functioning, learning and memory, language, perceptual motor, social cognition. So these are the kind of questions or issues that you are trying to establish to make sure that the patient meets the criteria for senile dementia or Alzheimer's disease. Then you proceed to treating this illness. So after you confirm the diagnosis of ADD, do not forget, if you want to make a diagnosis of ADD, you have to make sure that you're not dealing with hypothyroidism, you're not dealing with neurosyphilis, you're not dealing with HIV dementia, and the vitamin deficiencies. And then it's a little bit more tricky task. How do you differentiate Alzheimer's disease from dementia with Lewy body? In principle, dementia with Lewy body and Parkinson's disease dementia, they go with symptoms of Parkinson. In dementia with Lewy body, they are much more discrete, and they never precede the illness. In Parkinson dementia, Parkinson's disease dementia, the Parkinson symptoms are prominent and they precede the dementia. So that's pretty much the essence of the difference between dementia of Lewy body and Parkinson's disease dementia. So let's say you did establish the presence of the criteria for dementia. You did establish that it's an Alzheimer disease or senile dementia. By the way, there are also some biomarkers, but they are kind of a monumental headache. You can actually detect beta amyloid and tau protein and phosphorylated tau protein in the CSF. But the way you have to obtain the CSF is like pretty complicated. So you have to have a gauge of the needle not smaller than 22, and then you have to have only polypropylene tubing, not polystyrene, because polystyrene causes the amyloid beta to stick to it. You must take the specimen only between 8 and 12, because there's a diurnal variation of this beta amyloid. Is just a kind of a monumental headache. So, but anyway, let's say that you establish the presence of ADD, then you have to go to the staging. That means you have to figure out, is this a mild, moderate, or severe? So you are going to use, the best is to use some scales, and we use a mini mental status examination. You're all familiar with that. Alzheimer's dementia assessment scale, a little bit more unusual. Severe impairment battery, and functional assessment staging tool. So these scales are going to give you this demarcation between mild, moderate, or severe. In mild and moderate, you start automatically acetylcholine esterase inhibitors, Razadine and Cognex, and there's one more. And if you are dealing with a moderate and severe stage, aside from the acetylcholine esterase inhibitors, you also use memantine. memantine has a completely different mechanism of action, and is definitely something that you can combine. Immediately after that, you start the psychoeducation and the psychosocial treatments, too complicated to be mentioned here. And then you go to the treatment of comorbidities. That means things that can happen in the course of Alzheimer's disease. Do not forget, it's a humongous mechanism. The brain is a humongous mechanism, 80 billion neurons. When it starts decaying, at a certain stages of this decay, there are going to be some additional problems that might appear. Depression and anxiety. Depression appears with a incidence of 10%, anxiety 60%, very rare hypomanic manic symptoms. Psychotic symptoms, also, I'm not sure what is the incidence, but I would estimate that it's kind of in the region of 20-25% of the people will experience psychotic symptoms. That means delusions and hallucinations, and then non-specific agitation. You see what they are treated with: depression, anxiety with antidepressant SSRIs, hypomanic and manic episodes, carbamazepine divalproex, agitation with SSRIs. Don't forget about this little tiny detail: carbamazepine, divalproex maybe questionable, trazodone also questionable. And finally, the psychotic symptoms, you have no other way. You will have to use antipsychotic medications. This is the story of the antipsychotic medications. They have a black box warning. Does that mean that you should never ever touch them? Absolutely not. These are the only medication that will address psychotic symptoms. The story is like this: there were 17 placebo-controlled trials. They involved olanzapine, aripiprazole, risperidone, quetiapine, a total of 5,000 patients. In 15 of them, there was an increase in mortality 1.6 to 1.7 fold. So not even a doubling of the mortality, but it was an increase in mortality, mainly from heart-related events or infections like pneumonia. And according to the principle, well, if you try one agent, second agent, third agent, fourth agent, you just say enough is enough, and you just slap a black box warning on all the class of neuroleptics. So that's the story of the neuroleptics. So what do you do? They are not to be avoided, but you have to get informed consent before you use them. And informed consent should be an honest, informed consent. You do not, how do you call it, extort or extract the informed consent. You just put the facts in front of the patient and his or her relatives. Again, consent from the patient with dementia is not going to hold in any court. So it is nice to have it, but do not forget that you have to go to the relatives. But the most important is, if there is such a designated person, the healthcare proxy. So when you are dealing with a healthcare proxy, the consent is going to be as good as being obtained from any other patient. And if you have the consent, then you proceed with treatment of the psychotic symptoms, which do not respond to anything else. So this is the story of dementia and of its treatment. This is the last presentation in the set of 5 that I had for this educational cycle. And I just want to remind you that we talked about treatment-resistant depression, then bipolar disorder, then substance use disorder, ADHD, and finally now dementia. So I guess this is my contact information if anybody has any observations or suggestions. And probably I'll see some of you later in the year. I guess I am on time. Do you have any classes after that, or this is the last one?
This is the last one.
Okay, beautiful. Okay, good luck with the clinical activities, and hopefully we'll see each other again next cycle.
Thank you so much for all your lectures. Thank you.
Thank you as well. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Rachescu.
Thank you. Goodbye.